नहीं मेरा मैं यही काउंटर को प्रेस करता हूं। ओके ओके
Bhavas, I am audible? Shall we wait for 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes more? हाँ मैडम हाँ ओके
Yes, Viral, you are audible. Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Sir, shall I start? Shall we start?
Yeah.
Now it's 4:30. Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Vikram Sarabhai Library, I, Viral Navik, welcome you all to our online book talk program. For today's book talk, we have a very young and dynamic personality, Professor Chinmay Tumbe, Faculty of IIM Ahmedabad. We would like to thank Professor Chinmay Tumbe for kindly agreeing to review his newly published book, The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, How They Shaped India and the World, published by HarperCollins. This is his second book after India Moving, A History of Migration. And in this program, after a short introduction of author, there will be 40 minutes talk, and then after we will take a question answer session. So Professor Chinmay Tumbe, we all know, loves to laugh and learn. He is very passionate about migration, cities, and history. He is an alumnus of London School of Economics and Political Science, Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, Roy College, Mumbai, and Rishi Valley School, Madanpalli. He has been faculty member of Tata Institute of Social Science, Hyderabad. He was a 2013 Jan Monnet Fellow at Migration Policy Center, European University Institute, Florence, and in 2018, Affled D. Chancellor, Journal International Visiting Scholar in Business History at Harvard Business School. He has published widely on migration for decades and served in policy making groups. So I request Professor to take over.
Thanks so much, Viral. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Great. Thank you so much for organizing this. I'm going to share some slides on the book. Can you see this?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. So let me start now. Thank you so much to the library for doing this. This book is, in fact, the outcome of our library, Vikram Sarabhai Library. So it's a huge sort of pleasure to be able to give a talk organized by the library team. And of course, the book is dedicated to our very own librarian, Dr. Anil Kumar. And so let me start by paying a tribute to Dr. Anil Kumar, who's not only run a fantastic library, but the team which he has sort of shaped over the last so many years has been so instrumental in bringing about this book. Because remember, this book was written in the lockdown. This book came about in literally record time. My first book took about 10 years to write, in terms of research, and this book came about in 10 months. And this would really not have happened without the fantastic support of our library. So this book is about pandemics, and obviously this book is written in 2020, and it arguably would never have been written before that, simply because it was a contemporary theme. And when the pandemic struck, there were a lot of things which happened, including, for example, this migration crisis last year, which set me thinking, even before the migration crisis, that we don't talk, there is really no book about pandemics in Indian history. And yet, when I had done my research on migration, especially the history of migration, you could see that there were so many pandemics. You could see that there was cholera, there was plague, influenza, which I had written about in my doctoral dissertation. And yet there was actually no full-length book which covered these major pandemics. So I thought it'd be a good idea to revisit that. And as I started doing research, I saw so many parallels. For example, this migration crisis last year of people going back home, you saw it about 100 years back as well. This is an image from the plague of Bombay, which hit in 1897. And you see that so many people out here in this particular image are trying to go back home. But the difference in these two images is that on the right, that is COVID, we did not have the trains. The trains were shut down. On the left, the migrants could go back home by trains. And of course, we saw those shocking visuals of people walking back home last year, a lot of distress overall in the economy and so on. So I'm starting with this just to point out that there are actually close parallels on a variety of themes, migration being only one, whether you take it as vaccination, the seasonality of the virus or the bacteria, how society responds to the pandemic, ideas of the super spreader. This has happened before. And India in particular has had a devastating history of pandemics, which is what this book talks about. So there are two core arguments of the book. One is that this particular period of history, 1817 to 1920, this is about 103 years of history. We're saying typically when you think of this period, you don't think of pandemics. Okay, you think of issues like globalization, when the world started being interconnected through steamboats, railways, telegraph. You think of empire. India, when we talk of Indian history, it is always about the rise and fall of British rule in this period. First, the consolidation of British rule. And by the early 20th century, by the time we reach 1920, we have reached Gandhi, and Gandhi has emerged on the political stage in India. And so that is how we read our history. It's a very political history in which pandemics, epidemics, they don't really emerge. If at all we do learn about something of death, it is usually famines. You might have heard of famines in Indian history, but not so much about mortality through epidemics. The second reason, so the first point of the book is that actually when you look at it in this period, the main theme, especially for Asia, is actually pandemics. It hit India, it hit China, it hit Japan, it hit Korea. And so we can't really understand this period without understanding pandemics. The second argument of the book is that there is tremendous value in actually remembering past pandemics, precisely because we forgot some of the past pandemics. We kind of forgot how we respond to migrant workers. We forgot how interstate coordination can happen. So there's a lot of kind of losses in memory which I think are important to restore. And then I'm going to end this talk by pointing out to some of these sort of so-called lessons of the past. And there's particular value in remembering it in India, because India, as this book argues, the title of the book is Age of Pandemics. The subtitle is How They Shaped India and the World. Now, pandemics almost by definition means it's spreading across many countries, continents, and so on. But India was the epicenter of all those pandemics. So this is how the book is structured. It has 3 core chapters, and there are 3 core pandemics which I'm talking about. The Age of Pandemics is about the cholera pandemic, the plague pandemic, and the influenza pandemic. The cholera and plague pandemic are caused by bacteria. Influenza is caused by a virus. So that's the difference between cholera, plague, and influenza. All 3 of them touched all continents of the world. So they were true pandemics in being global, but they had very different mortality. And the book then ends with a reflection of what we can learn from them. So this is how the book actually looks like. Of course, what I'm going to talk today is just a very tip of the iceberg, kind of a flavor of the book. There's a lot more which is in the book, and I hope you get the opportunity to read it. So this is in a nutshell, what happened. Cholera, plague, and influenza killed collectively more than 70 million people in this period of about 100 years. And most of those deaths, about 40 million deaths, literally happened in 1 year, actually a few months, which is 1918, and that's the terrible influenza pandemic. But what's more interesting, if you see this chart, is the last column. In every of the three pandemics, India was the epicenter of mortality, which means India was the worst hit in all the three pandemics. Right? And so this is really kind of an important thing to absorb, because if you had never heard of the word pandemic before COVID-19 struck, it is quite remarkable, because 40 million Indians died in that process. 20 million Indians died just in a few months of 1980. In fact, that number is more than all the people who died during World War I and so on. Okay, now if you see this second column, the terminal date is 1920. It doesn't mean plague vanished after 1920. Influenza, yes, it kind of pretty much disappears in this particular strain that was circulating. But we are saying plague and cholera start to weaken after 1920. Okay, and part of that story, they have an interesting story as to how these pandemics end. I'll talk about that later. But this is the overall idea of the book. It's about a particular period of history with three deadly pandemics which devastate much of the world, particular countries more affected. Okay, and India being the epicenter in all. Now there's the book, and then attached to the book is actually a freely available working paper where all the statistical analysis, maps, charts, time series is kept. That's not in the book, but that's freely available online, and that's come out as an IMA working paper called Pandemics and Historical Mortality. So that's where so it's about a 90-page document which has a lot of references, a lot of charts, maps, all the statistical analysis. So I'm not going to go through that. I'm just going to give you a snapshot, and I'm going to do it through pictures, because it's the best way to understand the past is not through tables, but through actual pictures, paintings, and so on. So this is a presentation mostly through pictures. Okay, so it all starts in 1817. Okay, why 1817? Why not before? And what is cholera? Cholera is a disease we now know caused by bacteria. When it happened, remember, in the early 19th century, nobody really knew how diseases happened. The leading theory in the early 19th century was that bad air causes diseases, what is called as a miasma theory of diseases. So when cholera came, of course, you have different traditions. You have the Western medical traditions, you have Ayurveda, you have Unani. So different medical traditions had already described cholera. They knew cholera. It was definitely not known. And I'll tell you what exactly is cholera in the next slide. But I want to tell you that in 1870, what happens seems to be is that a particular kind of mutation seems to be happening, which makes cholera extremely virulent. So it starts moving around India. I've not yet come to how it's moving. I'll talk about that. It starts moving around India in very fast. And within 2 years, remember, this is a time of no railways or anything. It starts off in Jessore, really, or in Eastern India in August 1817. And by 2 or 3 years, it has kind of reached all parts of the subcontinent. And so this is a map by Leonard Rogers, who had an important role to play in ending cholera, to kind of show the depiction. And when it happened, people are truly clueless. People thought the wind is carrying the disease. Later on, we now know that cholera is mostly a waterborne disease. And if you just have good drinking water, you can reduce the chances of getting cholera tremendously. But it created a lot of panic. It created a lot of social stigmatization. A lot of new issues propped up because it was unusually virulent. This is how it would look like. So what was cholera? This is an image from Europe. You'll see this picture of this lady, and then a lady who's got cholera, the face turning blue, sunken eyes, lips turning blue. This is a kind of stylized case of what cholera would do. But cholera is essentially a disease of dehydration, right? In the sense that what would happen was, if you got cholera, the symptoms was some amount of fever and headache and so on. But the critical thing was that you started passing a lot of motions, right? Which means basically you go to the toilet very often, as simple as that. And there would be a rapid loss of water from your body. And so that is why cholera was essentially massive dehydration. Now, in order to solve that, eventually, the greatest sort of discovery made in the medical world, many people say, was oral rehydration therapy, which means you just take a few salts and you can cure yourself of cholera. But that has to wait about 150 years. So in 1817, they were 150 years away from the eventual great solution for cholera. In between, a lot of trial and error, but for about 80 years, they were truly clueless. Cholera was quite deadly. Case mortality rates were more than 50%, which means if you got the disease, you had about 1 in 2 chance of surviving. Right? So that's what we mean by case fatality or case mortality ratios. So it was a very deadly disease, and you could die within a few hours. There were cases where people died within 4 hours of contracting the disease. So you can imagine what the disease was. Not only was it deadly, but it also, this added aspect of going to the toilet meant it went against a lot of social norms. So it was a very peculiar kind of disease which kind of started ripping around India and then the world. Okay. This is another picture of cholera, which kind of tells you the state of medical knowledge. And some of it we saw last year. People said, take hydrochloroquine, take remdesivir. A lot of kind of competing claims about what can cure COVID-19 or what can get you back to this thing. So this is an image which tells you this man is fortifying himself with all these different suggestions on what to do. And yet cholera is, there lurking from the back about to snatch this person. Right? And basically, many people have said, for at least 40 years, until the 1850s, people were completely clueless about how to deal with cholera. So everyone gave their suggestions, but nobody really knew if it actually worked or not. In India, one of the most important kind of curative properties was of opium. So it was suggested that you have a bit of calomel and opium in order to get over cholera. This is an image of cholera reaching the US. It starts moving out from India, goes to Russia, Europe, and so on. I'll come to how it moves around, but it kind of reaches America and it devastates in 3 particular years, 1832, 1849, 1866. Now you might wonder, why is it called a pandemic? Isn't this an epidemic? We call it a pandemic because a lot of these outbreaks happened simultaneously at the level of technology of transmission that existed back then, and it kind of swept around the world fairly quickly. But yes, it is the case that some countries were more affected than others. We say cholera was endemic, which means it was always there in Eastern India, but from 1817, it starts to go around the world. So cholera was not something new, but some kind of a new strain seems to be appearing, going around. This is an image from Egypt. The country which was most devastated by cholera as a percentage of its population was actually Egypt. Right? And this kind of shows you about mourners returning from a funeral in a coffin. Right? So Egypt was one of the worst affected regions of the world by cholera. An example of quarantine. So how did people start to deal with cholera? Right? Did they have lockdowns? Did they shut down economic activity? They did, to the extent they could. And the major way they did was to have quarantines at seaports, just like we have quarantining systems today. In a way, the root of quarantines were not created in the 19th century, but they started getting very advanced level of kind of attention in the 19th century, precisely because of cholera. So this is an image from Russia where you see people, you can see them distanced. There was this idea that you have to keep a particular distance from each other, what we would call as social distancing today. Though actually, when you see the disease, all this doesn't matter. It's not that if you are close by or far away, you can escape from the disease. Okay, but these were certain norms that emerged. Now, why is cholera important from our perspective of today? Is one of the things cholera does is initiates global health surveillance. So for the first time, different countries or kingdoms are talking to each other about how do we stop cholera from coming to our place. And cholera was seen as an Indian disease. So it was called Indian cholera, just like some people call COVID-19 as a Chinese virus. Cholera was called Indian cholera, and India was blamed for the pandemic. So people around the world for almost 100 years were actually blaming India as a source of pandemics. Again, just like how a lot of people criticize China today, India was at the receiving end back then. Okay, and this particular quarantine systems, were they effective? A lot of controversy. Sometimes it seemed to work, cholera would die out. Sometimes it would not work, so people would say quarantines are useless. Much of the debates we're seeing today on the effectiveness of lockdowns, played itself out in the 20th century. The key with cholera, though, was understanding transmission, and it took a long time to understand transmission. Now, it was finally decoded by a person called John Snow in England, who on a map saw that cholera seemed to kind of, occur, especially, he basically gave proof of cholera's waterborne nature of disease. So he did a classic experiment, he used maps, and, he did a variety of things. As a result, in Western Europe, they started investing a lot of resources in purifying drinking water systems. And here's what the transmission of cholera was. What John Snow argued was that we drink water and the cholera germs or the bacteria are there. He didn't know it was bacteria. He just said that there was something. And when you drink water, then you go to the toilet and in the body, the water fluids come out of your body. And then the sewerage, if the sewerage goes out and mixes again with the drinking water source, basically that loop is complete. So cholera transmission is what medical scientists call it as fecal oral transmission systems. So it's when sewerage systems are connected with drinking water systems. And so the solution then was very simple. It was nothing to do with air. It was nothing to do with masks. It was basically to have clean drinking water. And that was as simple as that. That would basically be a major prevention of cholera. Europe started investing in this. New York, US started investing in this. And cholera was pretty much ancient history by the time of 1870s. So cholera hit Western Europe and US for a few decades, but they understood the transmission and contained it. Remarkably, for about 40 more years, the Indian Medical Service officers, and these are British officers, they basically said that cholera is airborne, it is not waterborne. And this is how strong the dogma was about the transmission mechanism, because people had not heard about germs, people had not heard about bacteria. This happens only after the 1880s, what we call as the bacteriological revolution. So while some people had taken the lead that it was waterborne, the Indian Medical Service officers claimed that it was airborne. This is a map, which is a very interesting map. It shows different castes living in a village, and you see all the high-ranking castes on one side of the village and all the low-ranking castes on the other side. And this particular officer called MC Fernell very interestingly pointed out that cholera in this particular village actually struck only the high-ranking castes. Why? Because they had these two wells, and because there was strict residential segregation, the water source was very strictly separated from these two sides of the street. And so just like John Snow, he realized actually that it's a waterborne disease, but by most accounts, he actually lost his job. So strong was the idea that it was airborne, that if you said that cholera was waterborne, you were seen to be going against the grain. So a lot of deaths which could have been prevented in India actually went on until the 1900s. Finally, cholera was kind of ended, not so much by vaccination, it was really other means, but vaccination did emerge out of this. And it's very important because right now when we talk about vaccines in India today, we talk about Serum Institute, Adar Poonawalla and so on. This is a big part of India's vaccination history, is the person that you're seeing in the middle of this photograph, a guy called Hafkin. Right? And Valdemar Hafkin is a European trained scientist. He comes to India to test his cholera vaccines, right? And he gets acceptance. The vaccines are not, they're more than, the efficacy, he claims a lot of efficacy, but it's not 90%, 100% efficacy. He's claiming that it's, at least more than 50%, which means if you take this vaccine, if you take that shot, as you can see in this photograph, that maybe, this vaccine might work. As it turned out later on, Hafkin got a bad name, unfortunately, when he was indicted in a vaccination case which went wrong. A lot of people died out of some certain vaccines. But then later on, his name was cleared when they realized it was not the vaccine's fault, it was the implementation fault. But those were important aspects in India's vaccination drives, early vaccination drives, because it set back vaccination by a few years. Because people were scared of vaccines. Just like we see today, people are very uncomfortable with the idea of vaccines. It was very tough to sell those vaccines after that initial disaster. And that's why it's so important to minimize adverse events in the rollout of vaccines. Hafkin stayed on. He came for a few months in India, but he stayed on for almost 20 years. But most famously, the lab that he started working, after cholera, he started working on plague, and then he set up a lab, and that's now today called the Hafkin Institute. So if you go to Bombay today, there's a institute named in his honor. It's called the Hafkin Institute. And it's actually the Hafkin Institute which started, which would require serum. And that's how the Poonawalla family actually came into vaccination. They would supply the stock because Poonawallas were actually a horse breeding family. And so they started, supplying this stock to the Hafkin Institute. And that is how actually the Poonawallas enter vaccination. They had nothing to do with, vaccines. They were horse breeders. But from horse breeding, they actually entered the vaccination business thanks to this connection with the Hafkin Institute. And the Hafkin Institute was linked to the cholera pandemic. So just like you have the, this link between those pandemics and today through vaccination, the other link is, of course, as I said, global health surveillance. A series of international conferences started to curtail cholera. And those conferences eventually culminated in 1948 with the creation of the World Health Organization. Right? So the WHO is actually nothing but the culmination of a series of conferences aimed at essentially curtailing cholera. So a lot of legacies that we see of cholera even today. It was ended eventually by a variety of people. Four of the most important people I mentioned: John Snow, who claimed about the waterborne series. Robert Koch is the guy who identified really the bacteria that caused cholera vibrio. Leonard Rogers, who was based in India, discovered what is called as IV treatment, intravenous treatment. He said, if people are losing water, why don't we inject water in them? And so he developed hypertonic solutions to sort of, inject in human beings, and he perfected that art. It's thanks to Rogers that case fatality rates started falling from 50% to close to 10%. So that's the big breakthrough in the early 20th century. But it's the biggest breakthrough in cholera actually happened by an Indian scientist, in a government college in Calcutta, where Sambhunath Dey discovered something called as cholera enterotoxin. He discovered really exactly how cholera hits the body. And it's because of that we got better vaccines. It's because of that we actually eventually got oral rehydration therapy. So these are the four principal people who played an important role in curtailing the pandemic. So this is a pandemic which is very prolonged. It doesn't have its same intensity every year. It is seasonal. It comes in certain months of the year. And there were a lot of controversies over its transmission, just like we have some controversies even today. A lot of people didn't understand why some places were hit more than others, all the stuff that we're seeing today about COVID-19. But it's a pandemic which actually does not go out because of vaccination. It goes out because of a great understanding of prevention and a great understanding of eventually cure. But prevention was key. And the idea, once they hit upon the waterborne idea, that solved most of this problem. I'll now move on to the second pandemic, which is plague. Plague has been there throughout history in the sense that there was this famous Black Death in Europe, which cut down 1/3 of its population in the 14th century. Plague has hit even Ahmedabad city. Ahmedabad city in the early 19th century was hit by plague. But when plague hits Bombay in 1896, which most likely it came from Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong it came from mainland China, it caused a lot of a storm, and the British went overboard, just like last year the Indian government, to curtail this pandemic, and they instituted a series of surveillance kind of laws. One of the laws that they passed is still with us today. It is the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897, and this is how COVID-19 is being fought. So the biggest legacy of the plague is the legal architecture to fight a pandemic, which India has been using for more than 100 years. This is an image which shows you how people react first up to a pandemic. It's about prayers. Last year in COVID, we saw, go Corona, go, as a classic sort of line by a parliamentarian. So something very simple. People have, in the early 19th, early 20th century, people's beliefs were still not really oriented in a very formal medical science kind of a way. This took about 100 years of the 20th century to move people towards, those kind of systems. But otherwise, the first response of people was to pray. The other response was to run. So migration was a very common way to kind of escape disease. When plague hit, the kind of systems used were very harsh by the British. This is an example of disinfecting patients. We saw some similar scenes last year of people being literally dumped with because the migrants were reaching home. They were flushed with water and I think chlorine and something like that. Very similar scenes from the plague. And again, what they were doing, they had no clue what caused plague. Plague was this big mystery of throughout history, and nobody really knew what caused plague. And again, the leading idea was that it's something to do with filth, it's something to do with hygiene, it must be something to do about bad air. It turned out it had nothing to do with that. Plague is a disease, again, caused by a bacteria. It first kills rats. That's why plague is a disease associated with rats or rodents more generally. And when the rodents die, the rat fleas, which sit on the rodents, basically get hungry because the rats are no longer there and they want their blood meal. And so they fly and they come to human beings. So they come to anything nearby. So they start try and biting anything nearby. It could be other animals. And if human beings happen to be close to that rat ecology, then the rat fleas transfer this plague bacteria from the rats to human beings. And so this is actually how transmission of plague works. But this was not known for about 10 years when plague actually hit. The transmission story kind of appears after 1905. There's a person called Liston. He's an Indian medical. He's born in Secunderabad. He's an Indian medical service officer who finally discovers actually, or gives the proof for the transmission of the plague. And that changes the entire prevention strategy. So you no longer have pictures like this. You no longer have strong surveillance. All you had to do was rat proofing. So you had to build good quality houses. You had to ensure that you have to keep the rats away from human beings. That became the primary goal. And the book mentions variety of things. There were rat catchers. There was a rat scorecard. There were even cats actually implemented in many parts of India to catch the rats. So all sorts of things emerged once they discovered that the key transmission of plague happens from rodents to human beings via rat fleas. An image of a temporary hospital. When plague came, it overwhelmed the medical services, just like we saw last year in Delhi and many other cities. Overnight, a lot of hospitals had to come. It killed a lot of people. And eventually, this is how plague hit India, right? And what's interesting, if again to compare with COVID today, different state governments in India give kind of claim that they have curtailed COVID, saying that we have done a great job. I came back from Bihar recently and people said, we have done a great job in curtailing COVID. The fact is that we still don't know too much about COVID-19, why it hit some bodies more than others, why it hit some parts more than others. And the best example to give is plague. When plague arrived in India, people just assumed that it was going to hit all over India, but it actually barely touched South India, it barely touched Eastern India. Right? So Calcutta, where cholera was very prominent, actually got very little plague in the initial years. And so people like today in Bihar claimed that they had done a great job in protecting themselves against plague. It turned out later that plague actually occurred only where there were particular kind of rats and particular kind of rat fleas. So there's a particular ecology which was required for plague of those times to spread. And that was pretty much along the Gangetic plains that you can see out here. So this entire stretch from Punjab to Bihar and along the western Ghats. Most other parts of India, of course, Ahmedabad also got plague, but it was quite different. It involved a lot of volunteering. Just like last year, so many people moved out on the streets to do volunteering services. Plague, if you worked in the plague kind of relief work, you would get this certificate called Plague Duty Commendation Certificate. So it involved a lot of people working on the ground, because what people realized was that the way to beat plague is, one is rat proofing and so on, but otherwise just get out of the place. So the best response for the majority of the population was to leave the village and camp outside the village, because plague was seasonal. There were only a few months of the year in which the rat flea could be, a powerful transmitter of the disease. So people knew the seasonality, and when plague would arrive, people would just leave their homes, camp for the day, camp the night outside, and then come back to the village or the town during the day. I estimate, literally tens of millions of Indians were living in kind of almost like refugee camps throughout for about 10 or 20 years of the early 20th century. And these are remarkable. I mean, you see this in literary references in a variety of things. This is an example of a vaccination certificate called an inoculation certificate provided in Punjab. You'll see, various details, just like how we are giving these certificates today. This is in the context of plague. Plague went outside India as well. It revolutionized the health system in Brazil. It had its own impact everywhere else. But 12 out of 13 million deaths happened in India. The other big country affected was China. Brazil was affected to a certain extent. It had a different response in different places. In South Africa, some say it contributed to more segregation. It laid the foundation of the apartheid system. In America, it strengthened and it's very racist immigration laws. They set up this 1905 law, which curtailed Indians and Chinese to move to US, which was finally repealed in some major way only in 1965. So plague had this outsized effect. Even when it did not kill people, it led to massive changes in laws, in societal responses across the world. This is in China, during the plague outbreak in 1910. Again, this image is very similar to what we see today, what we'd call as PPE, a protective kit and so on. So plague was eventually won when we understood transmission. So important people in the story. First up was actually Savitribai Phule. In the case of India, who really was this great social reformer who went out on the streets, started plague clinics in Pune, and tried to deal with the pandemic head on. Unfortunately, she died of plague herself. Right? So it's important to put out there that a lot of women in particular had tremendous roles to play in pandemic management and response, because they were often what we call today as frontline workers. They were the nurses. They were the people looking after people who were falling sick. Shivasaro and Yersin are the two people who discovered the bacteria. So they are the scientists. And Liston, the guy that you're seeing here, actually then clarified the transmission mechanism of plague. So important heroes and heroines of the plague story. Now, how does plague actually end? Does it end because of vaccination? There is a vaccine, but that's not really how plague ends. Remarkably, and there is also antibiotics. So today, if you get plague, it's no longer deadly because you can have antibiotics. And of course, people living in Ahmedabad or Gujarat will remember there was the plague scare of 1994 in Surat, and the Indian government went overboard to contain it, and it turned out that it was not that big of a scare eventually. The most accepted reason as to why plague actually went out of India was not because of vaccination, or for that matter, even immunity of human beings. It's because of herd immunity among the rodents, right? Because even rodents eventually, so that's why plague appears in history in cycles. There are some centuries with no reported cases of plague, and suddenly, outbursts of plague. So the epidemiologic guys are saying that, plague happens in these cycles of immunity for rodents. So we just got lucky that the rodents got immunity from plague. And if they are not dying from plague, the rat fleas don't escape their bodies. And if they are not escaping the bodies, then the rat fleas are not, biting us. And that's why human beings are safe from it. So the plague pandemic kind of came and went on the whims of the bacteria and its host-parasite relationship with rodents. There was, of course, rat proofing. If you lived in a good structure, that's why the British rarely were affected by the plague, because they lived in good pakka structures. So if only we had enough of good pakka housing, for instance, a lot of this mortality could have been curtailed. I'll come now to influenza. Now, influenza is the biggest of them all in terms of mortality, but it's also much more short-lived. It happens literally in a few months. And the enormity of the situation, this is like influenza, for those who don't know, is like a flu. That's what we call it. It's like a cough and cold, but it can be fairly lethal. And this particular strain of 1918 was unusually virulent and unusually deadly. Okay, and the toll kind of, was reported in India in March 1919. It really breaks out in two waves. First in, early 1918, comes up back in the second wave, and the second wave is deadly around the world. It's transmitted around the world, people say, because of, the troop movement. This is the end of last year of World War I. And so there were troop movements from across the world. The starting point of the strain, most accepted theory, is Kansas in America. So this is a pandemic which we're saying in a way starts from America. Cholera started in Eastern India. Plague most likely started in China. And influenza, or what is known as the Spanish flu. Very unfortunate why it's called the Spanish flu. It's the most likely origin is actually America. And by March, the Times of India was reporting something like 6 million deaths. Now, the actual number, based on my research and variety of data sources, is that this number is actually 20 million. What had happened was that the entire data collection system had collapsed. They were just literally bodies being thrown out in the rivers, bodies being thrown out, dead bodies being thrown out in over mountain cliffs. It was India's most horrific demographic disaster that we know about, right? And what's interesting is that most of us have never heard about it. It's completely gone out of memory. Okay, this is from my own research. In fact, this is from my PhD research. If you see the notes, this is population growth rate in India between 1911 and 1921, and all the yellow shaded regions is where India had a lot of negative population growth rate. And the argument I give in this book is that the mortality was unusually high in certain parts of India because influenza came on the back of one of India's worst recorded droughts. So there were two things happening simultaneously. There was a drought, food scarcity, food prices going through the roof, massive inflation. Actually, that year had about 30% inflation. And after the drought came influenza. So wherever you got drought, rice price rise or food price rise, and influenza, basically, you were caught up. By some estimates, about 40 to 60% of the population of India contracted influenza, right? And we're seeing about 6% of the population died. Right? So these are horrific numbers, very, very high numbers. India and Iran were the two most affected countries in terms of intensity. Okay, just to give you a sense of how pictures look from that time. Unfortunately, we don't have good photographs of influenza in India. Why? Because the photographers themselves fell sick. So we have very less documentation of influenza in India. But this is to give you a sense of what's happening in the US. It says to prevent influenza, all the stuff that we see today. in a way, the protocol of what we call as wearing masks, etc., started from influenza 19. Right? And so keep them out, wear these masks. In sick rooms, wear a gauze mask like an illustration. Right? Don't cover your mouth when you cough and sneeze. Very similar to some of the stuff that we've seen. This is a cartoon showing you, how bad influenza was. It kind of really knocked out people as it went along the world. All right, so I'm going to wrap up now in 5 minutes. What do we learn? I've given you a brief glimpse of 3 major pandemics. In terms of geography, all of them touched around the world, but India was the main, it took the main sort of beating. And in the Q&A, I can maybe talk about why India and why not other regions. But when we see these pandemics and compare with today's pandemic, what kind of relationships can we see? First is, when the pandemic hit India, we had this huge China bashing. Right? Even now, people say there's a China-made vaccine, it's a Chinese virus. And you see parallels of this in all the previous pandemics. The first response in any pandemic is actually to blame somebody else. Right? Why? Because we have to change our behavior, we have to depress our economy. There are a lot of negative emotions at work, and it's the best thing to do is to find someone to blame. So initially, you'll see the blame was either China. In India, it soon became the super spreader. In India, it was the Tablighi Jamaat. In Korea, it was a particular church order. So it was quick scapegoating of so-called super spreaders. But what the history of pandemics tells us is that pandemics can start anywhere at any time. There is really no pattern as to why. There's nothing like a particular region of the world is more capable or more likely to start off pandemics. Pandemics have started in Americas, pandemics started in Asia. In the case of Black Death, most likely it started in Europe. And so what one has to really look at is not try and victimize or color other countries in negative light, but just look at your own responses and how do you react. Now, the biggest reaction, of course, was with migrant workers. And last year, a lot of us argued that what India should have done was that, let me put it this way, all pandemics require some migration. In the sense, you can't have a pandemic without some migration, because pandemics mean the virus or the disease has to move. And how will it move? It will move through human beings or certain vectors or disease carriers like rats or rat fleas. Right? Which means to curtail a pandemic, you have to curtail migration. But the question is how? And here I argue in the book that you can easily curtail international migration, just like everyone has done. You just switch off the airports, switch off the ports, and you're done. But you can't do that with internal migration because our internal borders are very porous. Interestingly, there are 2 incidents from history which should have guided our response last year. One was the 1890s plague. The British actually allowed special trains, the migrants to go back home on the special trains so that people basically would not have to walk back home. The British said that if we shut down the railways, they actually decided, should we shut down the railways? It's there in their decision-making files. Should we shut down the railways? They said, no, if we shut down the railways, people will still want to go back home. In fact, what people realized was that the unique nature of migration in India, which is highly circular, which means people have one leg in the village, one leg in the city. When a health crisis emerges, the first response of people is to go back. So 100 years back, the sentiment of what we saw last year was the same sentiment which was seen 100 years back. The sentiment of agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge. That is, if we want to die, we'd rather die in the village. Right? And that is what the first response of migrants. Coupled with the lack of social security in our cities, coupled with the shrinking of incomes, coupled with the lack of credibility of when the lockdown would end, because initially they said 3 weeks, then it kept getting extended. There was a complete breakdown of the kind of economic security of migrants in our cities. Right? And so while 100 years back, they could go back in trains, today, unfortunately, they had to walk. Of course, about 6 million people were sent back in trains called the Shramik trains, but that happened 2 months later. Right? And in that process, we got a completely unnecessary migration crisis. And that's, again, an important reason why to look back at history. In fact, in the book, I also point out that the Chinese actually did shut down the railways during the 1911 plague pandemic for migrant workers, and that was a disaster, just like it was last year. Why? Because migrant workers walked back home, and that was January 1911. That was the winter in China, and a lot of people died. It became a humanitarian crisis, just like what we had last year. So a huge learning is that you act early. That's an important aspect. You want to anticipate the pandemic and act early. But having said that, you need to send your internal migrant workers back home before you institute a lockdown. I think that's what we learned from the past and the current pandemic. There's a lot in the book on politics. I just point out this age of pandemics. When you look at Indian history, you've heard of 1857, the first war of independence or the Sepoy Mutiny. You've heard of people like Gokhale, people like Tilak, and of course, people like Mahatma Gandhi and so on. And of course, since we're in Ahmedabad, Sardar Patel. What is often not told is that a lot of their careers actually started off precisely because of pandemics. So the 1857 outbreak, the mutiny or the first war of independence, happened after a massive cholera outbreak. Right? And there is a research study which shows that the mutiny took place precisely where the cholera tensions were more heightened. Similarly, you come to Tilak, you come to Gokhale, even Gandhi, I argue in the book, his rise from 1919 onwards is because of influenza. The labor movement in India picks up because so many people die due to influenza that it actually increases the bargaining power of labor. And most famously, Sardar Patel. Since I'm sitting in Ahmedabad, Sardar Patel's political career starts off with the plague, right? And he is the he's the head of the sanitation committee in the Ahmedabad municipality. Right? So we have such an important political leader dealing with it. And then, of course, he does so many things later on. But he starts off really his political career in a big way through countering plague. And he's on the streets monitoring the progress. While a lot of officials are actually leaving the city, Sardar Patel is going around trying to figure out how do we curtail this pandemic. This is in 1970. Ahmedabad was not really affected by the plague for about 20 years and then suddenly broke out in 1970. There's a lot of discussion in the book on how do we look at economics, epidemiology, environment. Just to point out that while a lockdown might be the sensible thing to do, if it's going to crush the economy, you're going to have knock-on effects on other diseases. And so you have to think of lockdowns in a much more holistic fashion. Of course, we also realize that some benefits of the lockdown were in terms of a relatively more cleaner environment for at least a few days. So I'll end by pointing out this is something called as stages of a pandemic. When you see past pandemics and the current pandemic, it seems like they go through the cycle of 4. First, there's outright denial. Last year in February end, remember, Donald Trump came to Ahmedabad. And by this time, the pandemic had already started. There was a huge pandemic in Italy raging. And yet we were celebrating Donald Trump's entry into Ahmedabad. And even when pandemic was declared by WHO, we took a few days to register that such a thing could happen.
Excuse me, sir. Your voice is not audible.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now, perfect.
Yeah. For about 2 months, there was sort of confusion, then the acceptance, then the rise in cases, and then the fall in cases, right, which we can talk about. But what we learned from past pandemics is that epidemics, compared to wars, compared to other incidents of mass mortality, are easily forgotten. And that is why 100 years later, there was not a single book written, for example, on influenza. Right? There's very, very little research actually done on the history of pandemics in India in particular, but across the world. And that is because pandemics, despite killing so many people, is very prone to erasure. Why erasure? Because we like to forget negative events, especially when there is no commonly identifiable enemy. In the case of a war, when you win a war or lose a war, you know who to blame. And that is why we erect statues, we build memorials, but nothing of that sort has been done with pandemics. I mean, who remembers the famous scientists? Do we have great statues in their honor? Yes, we have the Hafkin Institute, but we could do much more in terms of memorializing those pandemics. But above all, understanding, teaching the history of pandemics in medical schools, in even our in our general history books, understanding that if we learn about the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, which killed a few hundred people in April 1919, then a few months before Jallianwala tragedy, 20 million Indians died. Right? And unfortunately, this is really not taught in our history textbooks. And that is why the bigger argument of this book is that we need to start engaging with our own history of deadly pandemics. So I'll end here and happy to take questions now. This is only a small book talk, only certain sort of elements of the book. But I'd just like to end with what is written in the book. This book is dedicated to the outstanding team out here, Hiral, Viral, and everyone out here from the library. And above all, memory of Dr. Anil Kumar, whom we miss a lot. And the book is dedicated to his passion for books and libraries, both of which make this world a much more beautiful place. So I'll end here and be happy to take questions from people.
Sir, there are a few questions in the chat box.
Sure.
One is, why India blamed for cholera? Did it occur first time in India?
Yeah, so this is Sneha's question. Okay, Sneha Bharati's question. So good evening, sir. Why was India blamed for cholera? Did it occur first time in India? So good question. India was blamed. So in fact, in the book, there's very vivid, just like how a lot of Indians blame China, right? India was really seen as the culprit. Not just India, a specific part of India, what is known as pilgrimages. It was thought that pilgrimages transmit cholera. Now, there was a certain element of truth in it, but it was not just pilgrims. It was also British troops which were transmitting cholera. It was also traders. There were a lot of people transmitting cholera. But the scapegoating, which we saw last year for COVID, was very strong by the British on particular aspects of Indians. So in Britain, it was very clear, Indian cholera. And India was seen as the site of filth. India was a scene of a site of where cholera, where pandemics are generated. But what we know about cholera before 1870, we know it existed. It was fairly well entrenched in Eastern India. We now know, almost 200 years after the 1817 event, that cholera is endemic in certain maritime systems of the world, right? And especially in Eastern India. And there have been cholera outbreaks even before 1817. But the bulk of that was Eastern India. Eastern India means today's, West Bengal, Bangladesh, and that region. Even if you saw the map which I showed you, it was pretty much around the river systems, but not so much along the Indus. So on that side, Punjab was rarely affected by cholera. Whenever Punjab got cholera, it could be traced to pilgrims who were going to the Kumbh Melas and so on. There's a clear sort of time series correlation with the Kumbh Melas on that. So the British got an easy kind of target, that is the Indian pilgrim. The Indian pilgrim going to Haridwar, Tirupati, Puri. Puri was seen as the worst offender. The people said the whole world should keep, the officials in the international health conferences, which said India is the worst offender for cholera. And within India, Puri temple or, Puri, Jagannath temple and so on are the worst offenders because that's where cholera really starts. Now, a lot of this was not true. In fact, now we know that cholera might have started from India and gone out, but it started becoming endemic in other places. So there's research on Japan, for example, which says that earlier it was thought that every outbreak of cholera in Japan came from India. But what new research shows is that actually it kind of became endemic in Japan and started breaking out on its own without an Indian resource every time. Right? And so just like we kind of blame China for everything related with COVID, I think a lot of the blame game on India was completely unjustified. But it was simple. The thing about pandemics is because of a lot of insecurity and anxiety, we feel we need something to blame because it's beyond our control. Right? And that is why, like how a lot of people blame China today, India was the source of all this hate back then. It's interesting, of course, that the scientist who eventually nails cholera is actually Indian. Sambhunath Day. So that was a very important part of the history of cholera. Did it occur first time in India? We can't really say. There are references to cholera in different languages. The book mentions this word called Visuchika, which is considered to be the closest equivalent in Sanskrit. It's known as Haiza in Urdu, Arabic. So it has been registered, but since it's very close, similar to diarrhea, we don't know, what exactly. It's very difficult to spot exact whether the disease you're seeing in the 19th century is the same of what, say, Sushruta, talked about thousands of years ago, and so on. All right, yeah. So Nishtha's question is, why during the plague people leave their homes during night and come back during day? How can this help? So this is, a very good question. It's amazing, actually. This particular practice of evacuation, we should see it as part of our traditional knowledge system because it worked. And people did this because the system clearly worked. And eventually, even the British supported this. The British first claimed that this is a stupid practice. But then over time, they realized actually this makes sense. In fact, the British pointed out in one report saying that in the 17th century, there was a massive plague outbreak in London in roughly 1665. And people were advised to stay at home during that plague outbreak. And actually, a lot of people died. Right? And they say, actually, this Indian practice of traditional knowledge, that is, if plague comes, if you see, dead rats, the first response is to move out. This has been enshrined in a lot of our literature. Right? I quote some of that literature. And over time, even the British realized that there's actually some logic to it. It turns out that there was actually a logic to it. Though the Indians, we were doing this without appreciating a logic. It just seemed to work. The logic is this, that these rat fleas are sensitive to light. Right? So the rat fleas actually bite us only in the late evenings and the night. So actually the transmission of plague happens at night was then later scientifically proven. And that is because people understood how plague was actually coming to the body. It was coming from the rat flea, and the rat flea tends to bite. So rat fleas are not hovering around during the day. So that is why plague, we're saying, is the disease of the night. Right? So it's interesting. It's very interesting that we hit upon the right practice to some extent. The best practice would have been to have pakka housing and keeping the rats at bay. That is why the British in the cantonments never got plague. That is why Indian soldiers in the cantonments never died of plague. Very few of them died of plague. It is just a lot of people living in kacha housing structures. But if they evacuated during and slept outside, as long as they were away from the rat ecology, they seem to be fine. So I hope that addresses that particular question. Related to that, Nishta, is women had much higher mortality of plague than men, especially in India. And again, we don't know exactly how much of it was innate to the disease and so on. But it turns out that women would be much more into nursing, just like Sarabhai Phule, and women had much they would often be the last ones to evacuate, and women would spend much more time at home than men. Right? And it was being at home that mattered. Right? And so that is another reason people say the mortality was much higher among women than men. I should point out that COVID-19 has a much higher mortality among men than women. So that's all the scientific evidence is pointing to. That's that it's sex selective. The odds of men dying are much more than women. Sanish's point is, India took the beating in other pandemics, but this time India seems to have done better. What could have been possible reasons? If you look at how do you define better, right? So better meaning, if you look at deaths per capita, I would say the bulk of the world has done well, in the sense that only US and a few European countries are high on the chart, right? But I just put this on Twitter, have a look at the charts. India is if you ask, how is India coping with COVID-19? Let's look at two parameters, deaths per capita and economic contraction. So there are these two major things that one would look at. And if you look at about 150 to 200 countries of the world, India is in the bottom half on both, which means there are a lot of countries which are doing much better than us. All we can say is that, in a way, the entire world, precisely because we have learned from past pandemics in terms of early action, have actually curtailed. If nobody had lockdown, obviously deaths per capita would be much more. So in a way, it's a success across the world of curtailing the pandemic, because everyone switched off the airports. That is a success story of this pandemic. That is, deaths per capita is not what we are seeing in the previous case. But that's a global phenomenon. That's not an India specific phenomenon. India, unfortunately, we've got this migration crisis, which nobody else had. Right? And so that is something which we should have learned from our own past, which we seem to not have done. But there are some success. I would say there are some very good things the Indian government did. Not only did we act early, the Indian government never, blamed the science like the Brazilian president. So we took the science very seriously. I think that's a great thing. And the whole vaccination drive now, India is at the forefront exporting the vaccines around the world. So that's fantastic. So there are a lot of good things which have happened. But I think the migration crisis was this monumental failure, which was completely avoidable. And it didn't really happen in any other country, because most countries, saw that this might happen and they allowed the migrants to go back, or in any case took, adequate steps to ensure that these migrant workers do not go back if the need arose. So my thing, Sanish, is that has India done well compared to our own past? Of course, except for the migration crisis in terms of deaths per capita. But compared to other countries in this pandemic, we are not at the top end. If you look at the economic survey, yes, the economic survey of India, which is a government document, compares India with all the worst performance. So India is on top. But if you look at India with 150 or 200 countries in the world, we are on the bottom half on both deaths per capita, and economic contraction. This is a paper by Angus Deaton. You can look it up. The question on state power was weak, local government was dynamic, role and effectiveness. I think what we can say is, in the past, one thing which did step up last year as well as in the past was civil society. Right? Once a pandemic starts going out of hand, the complete government machinery breaks down. And so the last line of defense is civil society. So part of the book talks about the response. I mean, I argue that the plague and influenza collectively was very important in forging India's cooperative movement. So, like Amul is a cooperative. The cooperative movement of India starts in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, precisely because a lot of people start getting organizational capabilities, trying to evacuate. Imagine evacuating entire villages and towns every day for many months for a decade. Right? So it's many of those leaders who started India's first cooperatives. Right? And so there's a civil society response, which was very important in those pandemics, which then led to political leadership. I think some of that we might have seen last year, especially during the migration crisis. A lot of people stepped up. There were these people, you should see this podcast of Ruben Mascarenhas with Amit Verma. There were these initiatives in Bombay to give food. We saw these initiatives in Ahmedabad. So I would say the state power, the way the state power works is through this legislation, right? So it gets complete control for itself. It can do what it wants. We saw last year some cases of excesses in that as well. But ultimately, it has to, any disaster management. And remember, this pandemic came under the disaster management kind of purview last year, would require very good coordination across multiple fronts. State governments talking to each other, bureaucratic departments talking to each other, and of course, close coordination with civil society. Community responses. So the Dharavi, for example, many people thought, this would completely blow out. There'd be huge mortality in Dharavi. But the Bombay municipality seems to have taken into confidence leaders of Dharavi, and very soon people understood what had to be done, basic sort of precaution that had to be taken, and that seemed to come under control. So a lot of people from Dharavi actually left, and so on. So definitely decentralization is important, but who is going to announce a lockdown, right? I mean, that lockdown decision has to be at a central authority, and that is why I don't think anyone is saying that never have a lockdown. I'm going to be the first votary saying some lockdown is very important in any pandemic, and that is why you would definitely need that central authority for that point. Yeah, Mohan's question: when will COVID get totally erased? I mean, this. I'm not Nostradamus, so I'm not going to tell you like if you want a month, in 2 months from now on this date, it will be completely erased. There are many reasons as to why one cannot really answer this question. Okay, but the one reason is, there are these serological surveys. As per the official number today, about 1% of India's population has got COVID. Right? But as per the latest ICMR study, about 21% of India has already had COVID, which means if you look at these antibodies, the sero surveys are basically pointing out, and this number is 21% for all India. It's about 26% for urban India, and it's about 31% for urban slums, which means about 1 in 4 people, right, in India, especially in urban India, have already got COVID. Okay, now the question is, what it seems to be at this stage, at this level of the strain of the virus, is that the case mortality does not seem to be very high unless there are comorbidities and so on, right? Which means we are in a way much luckier than what's happening in Western Europe and US. But all I'd say is we don't know enough. We don't know enough about the virus. Like I said, in the case of plague, people thought Eastern India, Southern India are doing something great against the plague. They just got lucky. They just got lucky because the nature of rats and rat fleas was such that plague did not really, hit Eastern India and Southern India. All I'll say is that I'm very skeptical of this argument that this is a very powerful argument in India. Somehow all of us have it, that we are naturally immune, right? We are naturally immune to disease. And one of the things the book points out is, 40 million Indians died, right, out of 3 pandemics. There is no such thing as just general natural immunity to everything. Just because we eat pani puri on the streets doesn't mean, we will survive every pandemic of the future. It might be the case that this particular disease, it may not be affecting as much, right? But why is it that we have such a high mortality rate in general? Why do so many of us die of tuberculosis? Right? What happens to our immunity then? right? So this kind of, Indians having better immunity and so on, one has to be very skeptical of such claims. We don't have, our health systems are fairly bad. We do fall sick. We have very high morbidity rates. We tend to fall sick very often. So I'll be very wary of anybody saying that, let's forget COVID completely because we are completely immune. I think that would be the worst argument. One has to be monitoring the trends very closely. And you can say that in fact, what I write in the book is that you should never celebrate the end of the pandemic. Right? In fact, that's the worst thing to do. After the first year of the plague, the Bombay municipality patted themselves on the back, said we have done a great job in eradicating plague. Plague ravaged Bombay city year in and year out for the next 25 years. Right? So never celebrate the end of a pandemic. If it goes out, great. You don't know why it came, why it went. Right? But one should be very wary of celebrating. There's one thing on mask recommendation. I think in India at least, I don't know, the situation now is probably different, but I think there was very good communication in the initial phases on mask usage. I think this mask usage was shot down in the US. Surprisingly, you would think that the US would be the first ones to adopt mask usage and so on, especially when you saw that photograph. It was a lot of arrogance. If you saw what happened with the political leadership in some countries of the world, not India on this matter, I think there's a lot of arrogance that personal liberty should be given more leeway over masks and so on. I think what's emerging from the scientific literature is that masks are actually very powerful, and that this is the most basic thing that you can do to keep ourselves reasonably safe. And so your question is, why was there so much confusion? Confusion came from a very poor understanding, I think the US in particular, on what I think it was just a failure of their leadership on this particular question. Yeah, so then there are a lot of questions here. Ajit's question I'll just take, and then there's some questions on the Q&A, so I'll come to that. I'm going on the chat box and then. So very quick responses now. Ajit's point on, any thoughts on why COVID active numbers are in declining? Ajit, as what epidemiologists are talking now is frank answers, we don't know why India has not had the second wave so far and so on. But all I'll tell you is I am privy to some discussions of epidemiologists who are working at the cutting edge of this. And what they're saying is that they're very careful. There's nobody saying that it's gone. And there's this UK strain and the South Africa strain, which people are monitoring very closely. It's a bit of a mystery. What it says, what if the numbers start going up again? Right. So I think there's a lot of stuff on which we are in a way exactly how people were in Bombay City in 1897, 98. It's only in 1905, 8 years after the first incidence of plague, where the transmission, a lot of the plague mystery started becoming deciphered. Right. Hopefully we don't have to wait 8 years, but I think we are still in a phase of a lot of ignorance. Right. So I think any honest response to that is we don't know. We don't know why the cases are declining. But it's not because, I think we should be very skeptical of claims that, oh, we eat in the Pani Puri stand and so we have got natural immunity. I think that's probably the worst sort of argumentation. Yeah, Ankit's question on principalities, how did the erstwhile rulers? So a lot of the book talks about the different responses of Britishers versus princely states. Now, can we say that Britishers responded worse than princely states? On average, well, I can't really say much. But all I'd say is that influenza, which was the worst, actually had a higher mortality rate in Hyderabad, Nizam ruled Hyderabad, and in Rajputana, the princely states of Rajasthan. Right? So it's not that just because, if you were in the princely states, the response was great. Right? But I do document certain practices. The Maharaj of Travancore was fairly, ahead of his times. For example, I mentioned this guy called MC Fernell and this idea of waterborne theory. It's the Maharaj of Travancore who actually reaches out to him and saying, you're saying something very interesting. Let's hear more from you. The other very relatively progressive kingdom is Mysore. And so I document, Visvesvaraya's response to influenza is there in the book. Visvesvaraya is fairly proactive, understood that even with some basic nutrition, you can tide over influenza. He understood this relationship between the drought and so on. So he ensured that prices are not going through the roof. Got price caps. He said, let's have affordable food. Let's ensure that people are at least healthy to tide over the pandemic. So that was a very good response, and Bangalore survived that influenza pandemic. It sailed through much better than most of the other cities of India. So there are clear examples in the book, if you read, of particular responses even within India, princely states versus British and so on. But at a general level, did the British do worse? I think, there are equal examples of both, and particularly influenza. While on the one hand, the British did mess up, as I point out in the book, by diverting the trains for, the World War I efforts. The food grains did not reach on time. It was almost like a famine-like situation. So that was a major, mess up by the British. But the fact is the mortality rates were really high in the princely states, in places like Rajasthan and places like Hyderabad. So it's tough to really say anything. Ajit's next question on this DRD report by Kalam on Surat plague. I'm not really aware of this, Ajit, so I don't quite know. The book cites Professor Dilip Malwankar's report, so I go with that. He kind of documented the Surat plague quite well. So when I talk about the Surat plague in the book, I actually go with what Professor Malwankar. Just going to a few questions. So Ramon Turga has a question on quarantining as a solution. Was based on the initial understanding that infection was airborne. Ram, I don't know if you're talking about cholera. The idea of, I think what you're pointing out is, this point of why should you have quarantining if you think it is airborne, right? So if it is anyway being airborne, then if you're essentially, because quarantine means you believe in the power of human contagion, right? This idea of quarantining, it's not invented in the 19th century. It was there before. In fact, even during the plague of the Black Death, people were experimenting with different things, and they said that we don't understand how the disease works, but maybe quarantining helps to a certain extent. But they never gave up, right? So they said this is generally diseases are airborne. It may be the case that human contagion may matter for certain diseases, and they said plague might be one of those diseases. So this was the kind of mental ordering. It was not a blanket. Because what you're saying is, if you don't believe in contagion, human-to-human transmission, then quarantining is useless. Why? The only reason you should have quarantining is if you believe in human-to-human transmission. Now, what happens with cholera is that there's so much uncertainty that they're willing to experiment. Right? And so quarantining really emerges from that willing to experiment in the 19th century. And that's why the literature is exactly like the literature this year on lockdown. Because, there's the effectiveness of lockdown is such a huge kind of subject of research today, people saying, all sorts of things. That's exactly, and that's what I've written in the book. The king says, king, I think the Habsburg Empire king says, we started quarantining, but then it produced results which were more mischievous than, the lack of quarantine, which is kind of saying, we did the lockdown, but then we got worse impacts than otherwise. But let's just say that, by the early 20th century, the idea of contagion is firm. Right? So people understand that you can have human-to-human transmission, and that's why quarantining across the 19th century gets more and more acceptance. So by the time we reach the plague in the 1896, quarantining is definitely highly recommended. Ishita has a point on medical education. It does include in epidemics, in public health. The question is, today medical education does include study of epidemics in public health studies. How can this be made relevant? Interesting to choose to study, sir, given your understanding. All I'd say is that, this is a book of history. And so I would just argue that we need to understand history. I think what history does is it kind of increases the sample size, right? So if in February last year, you got a WhatsApp forward which says, India has never been the home of pandemics, right? This is a book which tells you 40 million Indians died of pandemics. And these are actual WhatsApp forwards I received last year saying nothing to worry. Nothing. We are, Indian diets are very good. Nothing will happen to us. This pandemics is always a Chinese business. These are actual WhatsApp forwards I received. So hopefully, the whole idea of writing papers or books is to contribute to some discourse. And maybe we'll kind of, the value of history is to kind of warn us that we have had a history of millions and millions of deaths, and that we should always be on the guard. It makes more sense to be on the guard than to dismiss, or what I say is, denial. The first stage of the pandemic is always denial. People don't believe that it can happen to them. Why is it that East Asia responded very quickly to the pandemic is because they had SARS and swine flu, right? So they had these recent events in their memory, in their local memory. So they knew what to do. They knew that to wear masks. They knew what they had to do. Why did Kerala in that initial phase respond very quickly? Is because they had this 2018 Nipah virus. In a way, the local memory, the recent memory meant less denial. Right? So it's this 4 stages of the pandemic: denial, confusion, acceptance, erasure. The less we erase, the more or the less likely we're going to deny the next time the pandemic comes around. And we've seen it now. We've seen that regions which had pandemics recently were much more agile, much more alert to the threat of the pandemic than say US, which the last major pandemic they had was the influenza pandemic 100 years back, in which, by the way, Donald Trump's grandfather died. Frederick Trump died of the influenza pandemic, and Donald Trump's political career was finished by this particular round of the pandemic. So, in terms of popular discourse, medical discourse, all I can say is, from my vantage point, I think more history of medical science should be taught. That's all I can comment on that.
So, can we?
I think, yeah. Increase in population, lack of resources, new viruses and disease will always be there. This is, as Joshua Lederberg, Nobel Prize winning molecular biologist, points out, pandemic should be seen as evolutionary phenomena. There's this host parasite relationship which is continuously evolving, right? And so we can never fully say we are pandemic proof, right? So we can never eradicate pandemics, but we can curtail pandemics. So that is how one should see this whole concept of pandemics. And we have had good success with bacterial diseases. So we have antibiotics, and that's why cholera and plague, which are bacterial diseases, are no longer deadly. But we still have a long way to go to understand viruses. Right? And once we've figured out viruses, there'll be some new thing which emerges. So that is kind of a continuously evolving field. And I don't think we'll ever reach a point where we can say we are completely pandemic. And there are long, the Black Death happened in the 14th century. There have been long periods of gaps, and then suddenly it comes out of the blue. So will the frequency increase? It's an open question, but my sense is that part of this is fairly random. All right, great. Thank you so much for lovely questions, and hope there's something has been learned. And of course, you have to read the book.
Definitely. Thank you so much, sir, for providing this great insight of the pandemic history. And once again, on behalf of our library staff, we are really thankful for writing this book and contributing to the great memory of our beloved librarian, Dr. Rehydration Kumar. Thank you is a very small word, but I can't express in this words. So once again, sir, thank you so much. We are looking forward to your next book.
Thanks a lot, Vikram.
So we are leaving this meeting, and thank you participants to joining this session and participating in book talk series. Thank you so much. So sir, we are leaving this meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.